Hello everyone, this is Gabain the Christian. This is the first video in a series or a set of videos dealing with the question of whether Jesus is the Messiah of Israel. I'm making this video after already producing an hour-long audio, which I will upload as part 2, and I'm going to be uploading these at the same time. But that video was so long, and it was of course longer than I intended it to be, as always, that I wanted to be able to say a few things before you listen to that. So I'm addressing a few groups of people here. First of all, to my Jewish brothers and sisters, to my Jewish friends who are listening, I thank you for listening. And I want to ask you, as you listen to these videos, to listen, and this is going to sound patronizing, but it's really not meant to be patronizing at all. I ask you to listen with an open mind. And the reason that I specifically ask you to listen with an open mind here is because the kinds of things that I'm going to present and the kinds of ways in which I am going to argue that Jesus is Israel's Messiah are probably not things you have heard from others who have argued the same point. Now, I myself made a series of videos arguing with Rabbi Asher Meza, I think like 7 years ago now, about 7.5 years ago. I stand by with most of what I said, not all of it, but I would significantly restructure and add to what I said so that the whole framework and approach of my argument is changed. So if you've seen those videos, if you were watching at that point in the past, it's not the same thing today. I like Michael Brown. I think Michael Brown is a great guy, but my arguments are going to be structured a bit differently than Michael Brown's arguments. Some of these differences are theologically based. Some of them are not theologically based. Some of them are just the way I really like to read the Hebrew Bible and the way I find most helpful for seeing it in the New Testament rolled together. I say to my Jewish friends, I ask that you listen with an open mind, because I want to say right now that most of the material on the internet, and I say this in the other video, but I want to say it right up front here, most of the material on the internet arguing that Jesus is the Messiah is an abomination, and it is frankly disrespectful and irreverent towards the words of God that are given to Moses and the prophets. And the reason it's disrespectful and irreverent because it does not give any attention at all to what these texts actually mean. The way that these guys go about it, and if you search, why is Jesus the Messiah? This is what you're going to get. I mean, it is a human, spiritual, intellectual, moral travesty. And I'm only being slightly melodramatic here. It's appalling. The way that they go about it is the New Testament is a collection of texts that makes many references to the Hebrew Bible, in quotations and allusions and so on. And what the compilers of these ridiculous lists of messianic prophecies do is they essentially take every quotation of the Hebrew Bible from the New Testament and they label it a messianic prophecy. And then they put on one column the quote-unquote Old Testament prophecies, and then on the other column the quote-unquote New Testament fulfillment. Now what this ends up producing is something which no Jew or no anyone who knows the Hebrew Bible could take seriously. Because the reality is that most of the things that are being presented on these pages as messianic prophecies are not messianic prophecies in that very straightforward and simplistic sense. Let me just give you one example that I deal with at more length in the other video. Matthew. Okay, New Testament begins with Matthew, where everybody talks about the citations that are at the very beginning of Matthew's Gospel, as if these, just because they were right there, meant that these were the most important in the New Testament, which they are. I believe they're very interesting. I believe fully in the inerrancy of Scripture. I don't think Matthew did anything wrong. We have to understand what he was doing, though. So when Matthew quotes Hosea 11, when he quotes, "Out of Israel I called my son," it says, "This has been now fulfilled in what has occurred to Jesus in his childhood, in going down to Egypt from Israel and then coming back up." He is not saying that Hosea 11 prophesied the Messiah will go into Egypt and come out as an infant. It doesn't say that. Hosea 11 is telling a story about Israel as God's son. Exodus 4, it says, "Israel is my beloved son." And Matthew, his whole gospel, is structured around Jesus as the personal embodiment and the recapitulation of Israel's history. Peter Leithart has done an excellent paper on this, but essentially, if you start from the beginning of Israel's history, and then you move and unfold towards the exile and then the promised redemption, this is what you're going to find as the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. So Matthew is very interested in this concept of Jesus as the miniaturized one-man personal embodiment of the nation Israel. And so he quotes Hosea, "Out of Israel I called my son." And he says this is fulfilled or filled up in Jesus because Jesus is the personal embodiment of corporate Israel. And so his story resembles Israel's story. That's one example. It's not a messianic prophecy, that point is. Matthew is doing something which is very interesting, which I think is absolutely warranted, and I think it has something to teach us as Christians. I think we should be reading Scripture in these same ways, but we have to understand how Matthew is reading Scripture, or else we're just being dishonest. We're being dishonest or we're being lazy, and both of those are sins. And frankly, when we use them to, quote-unquote, preach the gospel, it becomes sacrilegious because it is shaming the name of the one whom we're trying to preach. I know many of these people have good intentions, but cut it out. Okay. Another example. The Psalms. The New Testament quotes the Psalter many times. And the Psalter, the book of Psalms, is the prayer book of Israel. Okay? So when the New Testament quotes a passage from the Psalms, and it says this is fulfilled in Jesus, it is not saying this psalm is a prophecy of Jesus. Okay, there are a couple of examples like this. Psalm 110, which probably deserves its own separate video. Psalm 110 is a prophecy. I'll come out and say it is prophetic directly. Most of the quotations of the Psalms are not prophetic in this very straightforward and superficial sense. And listing them as messianic prophecies, to anyone who knows the Hebrew Bible, is going to make you look like a joke, and it's going to make the messianic claims of Jesus look simply ridiculous. So stop it. The reason that the Psalms are quoted with reference to Jesus is, of course, who is the Messiah? One of the most central things in the messianic mission is that he's the son of David. He's the descendant of David who fulfills those covenantal promises that are made to King David, and that he will have an eternal throne. And so naturally, David has a very important story, and he writes a book of Psalms. He writes the 5-book Psalter, and it's expanded, but I think it was 5 books when David wrote it, and there are other Psalms which are added in within that 5-book framework, but however long you want to think it is, he wrote a book of Psalms, and the life of David, because God is sovereign over history, mystically foreshadows the life of David's son. Because God is unfolding history as a single grand story where all of the sophisticated literary techniques which any author will write in a fiction story, God is putting into his true story, and the Bible as his inspired textual word draws out the genuine meaning of that true story. So to my dear Jewish brothers and sisters, to my dear non-believing, non-Jewish brothers and sisters, and in case it's ambiguous, I don't think it is, but I don't want to be accused of pretending to be a Jew. I'm not Jewish. I don't think I have any Jewish blood in me. So I'm not pretending to be a Jew. I'm not wearing a kippah. I'm not using these fake Hebrew names, Yahushua, or anything like that. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, okay? So my descent is from Scotland and Norway. So I'm not pretending to be a Jew. I just say that right up front. But anyway, to both my Jewish brothers and my non-Jewish brothers, thank you for watching, and I just want you to keep that in mind, that if what you've encountered as the argument for Jesus being the Messiah is the kind of thing that I just described, I understand fully why you dismiss it. And if I myself thought that that was the only argument for Jesus being the Messiah, I would dismiss it too, because it would be intellectually honest to believe something so silly and so poorly argued. But thank God, that is not what the case actually is. Unfortunately, in my view, there are not a lot of people who are making this case in a kind of, apologetic, I hate the word, but an apologetic context. We're not, the question is Jesus the Messiah? And the answer to that has to be provided in a sound, textually grounded, biblical theology, which is rooted in the meaning of the Hebrew Bible and unfolds organically from there into the New Testament. The problem is that is being done. And this is something else I want to say to my Jewish listeners, if there are any out there. The kinds of things that are stated about Jesus being the Messiah in an apologetic context where someone is trying to convince you or anyone that Jesus is the Messiah do not represent Christian biblical interpretation in general. Now, there are some who have this idea that that Christians have a deep and abiding, some would even call it an obsession, to convert Jewish people and to make them Christian and to get them to validate Christian belief. Now, while there are lots of weird people on the web today, and I have seen some of those people, the truth is that today, at least, most Christians, Judaism is not on their mind, including most Christian scholars. Judaism is not on their mind. And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I'm just saying that's the way it is. And the way that we Christians, if you're not familiar with the Christian community, okay, the way that we Christians deal with the Hebrew Bible, or what you call the Tanakh, this is a conversation among ourselves. 99% of the time, we're not trying to convince anyone of anything. We're trying to understand the text better. So we write books for each other to read, because we're reading the book of Samuel, and we say, I want to understand this text better. And so someone, a believer in Jesus as the Messiah, writes a commentary on it, and we read it. And that commentary is going to reflect the idea that Jesus is the climactic endpoint of this story. The same is true for the prophetic book, for Isaiah. You're not going to get the best Christian interpretations of Isaiah in an apologetic context. The best Christian interpretations of Isaiah are not written in an apologetic context. They're written for other Christians, for the edification of other Christians, who aren't trying to prove anything. They just want to understand the text better. And we believe that the text is about Jesus. Now, whether that's true or not will be borne out or undermined in the productivity of the application of this model to the very specific and very concrete evidence of the text. This is really the way that we have to assess competing explanatory frameworks. Okay, it's very difficult in any discipline to take just disparate pieces of evidence and to build piece by piece an explanatory framework which is then going to work comprehensively. I cannot think of, maybe there's one out there, but I cannot think of a scientific model which has been constructed in that way from scratch. The scientific models and non-scientific models, we're talking in general, historical frameworks of explanation, these come to people generally in creative flashes of insight or in processes of reflection, and something will click. And over time, a person in their own mind, an explanatory framework begins to form and shape out. And then what do they have to do? They have to take that framework to the evidence, and they see, how does this engage with the evidence? And as it engages with the evidence, that framework is going to be refined. It's going to be altered in its details. I mean, this is the way that the standard model of particle physics is formed. There is an overall framework, but it does have to get refined and verified and altered in bits and pieces, as I understand it, as the data comes in. But it's not as if it is actually built from scratch, little bit by little bit. So it's about the application of explanatory frameworks, of explanatory models to pieces or frameworks of evidence. And the way that we know that a model or a belief is false is when we start to find that the problems in its application to the concrete evidence are systemic. That is, we do not find that when we're looking at the whole body of evidence, that we're seeing where all of this stuff kind of clicks together and it seems to fit together in beautiful ways. And then there's a problem here, and we think about it, we meditated on it, and oh, well, that eventually gets solved. That's a sign of a good model, especially if that model is going to start telling you stuff that you will discover in the future, or if you stumble across something in the future that is explained by your model, which you weren't even trying to explain in the first place. Yeah, this is stuff that's from the philosophy of science, but it works very well as a general kind of way of understanding how we're going to assess these different patterns of thought when it comes to the Bible. But a bad model is one where we take it to the body of evidence, and from the moment that we bring it into contact with the evidence, it's just like nails on a chalkboard. The first thing we hear is a clash, and we try to fix the clash there. And maybe we can fix the clash there, but then something else moves out of joint because it's a coherent whole, and we can't just alter it in bits and pieces. One change is going to affect everything, as in any good system of thought, it's going to be a coherent and integrated whole. And we keep trying, and we keep trying, and what we find is that there's just not a good fit. Now, this, to some degree, is going to be subjective. It's going to be subjective. I cannot definitively make anyone believe that my explanatory framework is as great as I think it is. And it's not mine. It's, the historic Christian understanding, as I myself have kind of engaged with the text and tried to explain it more precisely to you, my beloved audience. I can't, we all have to be fully convinced in our own minds, as Apostle Paul says. I can't make anyone believe anything. So, but I do think that this is a helpful way of looking at kind of the big picture, how we're going to engage with these questions, how we deal with large-scale differences in interpretation, including with biblical texts. I think it's a useful way of thinking. So, yeah, that's that. And that is how I understand engaging with the Hebrew Bible when it comes to Jesus. Okay, so I have a view. Now, I say Jesus is the Messiah, right? Now, that in itself doesn't say very much, right? Because what does it mean to be the Messiah? Well, Jesus is not Judaism's Messiah in the sense that he is not the kind of Messiah envisioned by traditional Judaism, at least as it is articulated by the counter-missionaries, which is I know there's complexities, as I talked about in the other video, but I'm not an expert in Jewish tradition. I'm not about to get in here and pretend to be an expert in the Talmud and start making fake Yiddish sounds at you. I'm just not an expert in the Jewish tradition. What I do study, what I think I know pretty well, is the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. You can engage with me on that, but I think I have a pretty good handle on it. There's always more to learn, but I think I've got a decent enough handle on it to be able to engage this question and have something to say. But if we say Jesus is the Messiah, he's obviously not Judaism's Messiah in the sense that what does Moses Maimonides think the Messiah is going to be? It's not the same guy, right? So he's not the Messiah in that sense. There are other meanings of Messiah. I mean, people love to say, well, the word Messiah, it just means anointed. So Christians don't understand that Mashiach means priest. It can refer to a king, it can refer to a prophet. I mean, okay, yeah, I guess your average, man in the pew Christian might not have an immediate knowledge of that. But let's be fair. I mean, the reality is that there are lots of Christian scholars who are believers, who know Hebrew, who know Greek, who understand these things. But that's just kind of a little bit of an excursus. So the word Mashiach in itself does not refer to a specific person. It just refers to the category of being anointed. So when we say Jesus is the Messiah, well, it's too vague. So what I mean when I say that Jesus is the Messiah, I mean that there is a particular figure that is developed throughout the Hebrew Bible, beginning from the Torah, in fact, beginning from the very early chapters of Genesis, and it unfolds in an organic and non-random way throughout the Torah, unfolding into the prophets, and then into the writings. And so we get this framework, and we get this structure at the completion and the sealing of the Tanakh, and that structure then neatly fits into what we find in the New Testament. So here's a way to understand it. This is just an analogy. Okay? We want to understand that the way that the Hebrew Bible works with prophecy is not random. So it is not as if we have a picture of the Messiah, a complete picture of the Messiah, which is then shattered into tiny little bits and then scattered over the text, as if these bits have no coherent structure in their own right. Okay, I hope it's clear what I'm saying. This is a little abstract imagery. Okay, so it's not random. There were some people who've talked about it like this: the prophets saw flashes of the Messianic age, and they just wrote down the flashes that they saw, but it didn't have its own internal order. It's also obviously not a hyper-specified and well-ordered portrait in the sense that it does not say the Messiah is going to be born on this date in history. He's going to be born on a Friday. It's going to be cloudy outside. He is going to be named this. He's going to do X, Y, and Z. He will be this old. And it does not read like a biography of Abraham Lincoln written 50 years before his birth. Clearly, it's structured in a different way. And so here's how I want to kind of understand it. And I don't know if this analogy is going to work, but this is what I'm going to take a shot at. Imagine that the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, is like a pyramid. Okay? A pyramid has its own, or a ziggurat, whatever you want to, some structure like this. It has its own architectural structure, which has its own beauty. Okay, it's intelligible as a pyramid, as a ziggurat. We can see that there's a reason that this brick is placed here and that this brick is placed there. In terms of the overall structure of the building, if you start removing bricks and rearranging them, you're going to lose something. You're going to lose something that you can't replace, because there's a reason that it's put in the order that it is. Now, at the same time, imagine that on each of these bricks, there is a piece of a portrait, which, when the whole thing is taken apart, you can rearrange it, and it will form a completely different structure, which is not a pyramid, it's a portrait. You rearrange the bricks on the ground on a flat surface, and you can get a portrait, a picture. Now that is going to provide a different non-random structure, which is intelligible in a fundamentally different pattern. But it's in continuity. See, it's the same structure. It's just arranged in two different patterns, both of which are intelligible in their own right and do what they're supposed to do, but which are really in continuity with each other and are really one thing. Now, that's just an analogy. If you have no clue what I'm talking about, just ignore. But what I'm saying is that there's a reason the Tanakh is ordered as it is. It's not just random. Okay, it's not just sprinkled with messianic prophecies here, there, and everywhere. There's a reason that we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then we have the former prophets, and then there's a break, and we have the latter prophets, and then we have the writings ending with Chronicles. There's a reason to all of that. And when we approach it on its own terms, with its own structure, we can begin to understand its reason. And my argument is that the more that we understand its own internal structure, the more that we are able to see this other portrait, which in its very structuring, it is trying to provide for us. And we understand that in light of the New Testament. Okay, so I talk about this more in the other video. But this, I want to just give some conceptual introductions. So, back to the word Messiah or Mashiach. What is the Messiah? Well, the concept of Messiah, which I am going to set forth and which I am going to defend, is in some continuity with Judaism's concept of the Messiah, but it's also a much broader concept, I think. I mean, Judaism is a big tradition, so there may well be much more continuity than I am aware of. But I'm not going to touch it, because I'm not going to pretend to know something I don't. But it's a much bigger picture, I think, than the picture you get, at least from the anti-missionaries. It's a picture which really begins with Genesis chapter 3, where we hear about the seed of the woman. And you might be going, what a ridiculous interpretation. I'm aware of that. That's classic eisegesis. Well, you know what? You got to hear me out, because there actually is a very coherent way to make this intelligible. And I've dealt with this actually in another video. But that's where you start. And as the Torah unfolds, it takes this fundamental thread of the seed of the woman, and it threads it through the genealogies, it threads it through the line of Judah, it threads it through Numbers 23 to Numbers 24, And the way that those texts are structured literarily tells us certain things about the Messianic identity. And then this is threaded through Deuteronomy 32 to 33 to 34. And then the prophets make their intertextual allusions and echoes to this. And it unfolds through the prophetic books as they take these particular literary characteristics which belong in the sections that I've just identified for you. And we identify and we interpret the narrative blocks which come in between these sections, which have these more explicit prophecies. We interpret those in light of the prophetic seams of the Pentateuch and then of the prophets. And then the whole thing, we go through this process of interpretation, and then we can ultimately identify Israel's Messiah as Jesus when we read the New Testament and we see, does the New Testament work as an explanatory framework? So that's the identity of the Messiah. We understand as Christians that the Messiah is Moshiach in all three of its principal senses. He's priest. We think he's anointed as the high priest. We would say after the order of Melchizedek, the king of righteousness we meet in Genesis chapter 14, and whom David mentions in Psalm 110, which we'll have to talk about specifically. What that means is he doesn't have to be from the tribe of Judah. He has a different kind of priesthood. We'll talk about what exactly that is and how it's rooted in the Hebrew Bible. When you look at the texts like Daniel chapter 7, and you look at the way Daniel 7 is structured, and the way that the Son of Man text is used in the rest of the book, and then in other places in the Hebrew Bible, it starts to tell you some very significant things. For example, Daniel chapter 9. There's a lot of discussion about Daniel chapter 9. There is the Anointed One in Daniel 9. Okay, this should not be translated the Messiah, the Prince. I mean, that is an over-translation. However, when we hear about a character who is an Anointed One, who has to anoint the Most Holy, and we've just seen in Daniel chapter 7 a vision of a Son of Man ascending on the clouds of heaven to the throne where the God of Israel sits, well, that sounds a lot like Leviticus 16, where the high priest is ascending up through the tabernacle on clouds of incense to the Ark of the Covenant, which is the resting place of the God of Israel, which symbolizes his throne in the heavenly courtroom. Daniel 7 looks a lot like a Day of Atonement scene. And then people say, well, why does it say that the Son of Man is corporate Israel? Well, once you understand its context in Leviticus 16, it's very easy to understand that. The reason is because this is a double ascent of the high priest. High priest ascends once for himself and once for the nation. So Daniel 7 is talking about this double ascent. We'll talk about that more. And this series may well take years to do because I don't have a definite schedule to do it. But we will talk about all of these various issues. So Daniel 9, Anointed One, anointing a Most Holy. That's language that's used of the high priest, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. That looks like something which is going on in Daniel chapter 7. Well, then you look at Isaiah 52 to 53, and you see sprinkling many nations, making intercession for the transgressors. Then you look at Zechariah chapter 3, and you see a high priest named Joshua, Yehoshua, which is the extended form of the name Yeshua, who is our Jesus, the one whom we identify as Messiah. And it says, this is a sign of my servant, the branch. Isaiah 11, a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. Speaking of the stump of Jesse, this is the son of David. You begin to see how these things fold into each other. So we think he is high priest. In some senses, I would argue, the high priestly identity of the Messiah is more fundamental than his royal identity. One of the reasons I would suggest that is because the high priest himself wears a crown. The high priest, in his very office from the beginning, already has royal characteristics to him. The same is not true to the same extent as of the king. But the high priest already has a crown from the moment that the office is created in the Torah. So there's already royal characteristics to it, which I think is important. The second sense is the one that I think everyone agrees on. He's the son of David. Okay, he's anointed in that sense. The king is anointed. Samuel anoints King David. We see in the Gospels, Jesus is anointed by the Spirit. Okay, this is a sign of his messianic claims as the son of David. He's from David's family line. We'll talk about those genealogies, which are not a problem. We will talk about the objections. So he's the son of David. And we think as the son of David, he bears the entire history of Israel on his own person. And the reason we think that is because this is something which is already sketched out in the Hebrew Bible. This is not a new concept for the New Testament. The idea that the king assumes the whole destiny of the nation on his own shoulders, something is rooted and grounded in the book of Samuel and elsewhere in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. I talk about this more in the other video. But just to give one example, 2 Samuel 7. This is the Davidic covenant. And the Davidic covenant is not a separate covenant. This is really a focusing down of the one covenant that God made with Abraham, which focused through Moses, gave it a particular form. And this focuses through David, so David and his family line carries the destiny of the nation. Well, it says, God says to David, I will make of you a great name. Well, that's something which is promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. So this promise of a great name is carrying through this specific seed line, which goes through Judah, as Genesis 49 predicted, which then goes through King David. So the destiny, the history of Israel, Israel's ultimate purpose and election, runs through this Davidic family line. We see in the end of the book of Samuel, there are rebels who say things like, we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. We have no portion with David. So you acquire your inheritance in the land by being joined in one way or another with King David. The whole destiny of the nation rests on the king. And so we understand Jesus as the Messiah of Israel, as the son of David, to embody the fate of the whole nation in himself. And this relates to one of the most important points that I have to make here. The fundamental task that the Messiah is supposed to accomplish, according to Judaism, and which I agree, is the restoration of Israel, the regathering of Israel. Now, the regathering of Israel in the Torah and in the prophets is something that is more complex and has more strange characteristics than you would at first think. Okay, it sounds very straightforward at first, but this is just not the case. We're going to look at how the regathering language is used in unusual ways in the prophets. But the regathering of Israel, this is the fundamental Messianic, the sign of the Messianic age. Now, what we see in the New Testament is we think that the regathering, the restoration of Israel, is something which occurred in the resurrection of Israel's Messiah. You say, that's nuts. And I say, listen up. I'm not going to make the whole case here. I'll make the case that this is actually what the Hebrew Bible is saying, line by line, very in a lot of detail. But I want you to just hear what exactly I mean by this. Now, we've already established that Jesus, as the Son of David, the one who bears the whole destiny of the nation of Israel on his own shoulders, we've already established that he is the personal embodiment of the nation. So he carries that whole fate. It's something that's important in Isaiah 40 to 55, a text which we'll look at in another video, which we have looked at, in fact, which I might just refer back to. He bears the whole nation on his shoulders. The exile, the concept of the exile in the Bible, as traditional Jews do recognize from what I have read of traditional Jewish texts. I can't speak to how prominent or integrated this is to the whole theological vision, but I do see the language of exile used in a broader sense. Exile begins in Genesis 3. God creates man. Where does he create man? He creates man in the wilderness. He does not create man inside the garden. This is an important point, I think. Just like Abraham is taken out of Mesopotamia and put in the land, well, God creates Adam from dust. Then he plants the Garden of Eden. Then he puts Adam in the Garden of Eden. And then he gives him a commandment, and Adam and Eve break the commandments, and they're exiled. That's how the Torah begins. Torah ends with the regathering from exile, Deuteronomy 30. Torah begins with the exile from the tree of life. They're locked away. The cherubim are guarding the gates of Eden. No tree of life means no eternal life. Well, the end of the Torah, or the Pentateuch, is the regathering of Israel so that they may love the Lord their God, so that they may live. So there are some thematic correspondences here which are hinting at a bigger picture, which does unfold within the Torah and without the Torah and the prophets. So we believe that the first and fundamental exile that is presented to us in the Hebrew Bible is the exile from Eden. It's the exile from Eden. And Jesus, as the personal embodiment of the nation Israel, who carries the whole destiny of the nation on himself, he enters into Israel's exile in participating in what the Apostle Paul calls the curse of the Torah. Now, some people get very upset about this. They say the Torah isn't a curse. Well, it's not a curse. Of course it's not a curse. It's a blessing. It's a gift. Paul says it's holy, righteous, and good. So what's he talking about? He's not talking about the curse which is the Torah. He's talking about the curse which is in the Torah. That's what Deuteronomy 27 is all about. Deuteronomy 27 and 28. There's blessings and curses. Jesus participates in the curse of Israel's exile by being crucified, which is the curse of the covenant. Again, I'm not making the case that this actually is the Messianic vision in the Hebrew Bible. I'm just setting forth what we mean by Messiah. So he, as the one man Israel, enters into Israel's exile by sharing in that curse. Exile is death. That's why Ezekiel sees exiled Israel in terms of a valley of dry bones. What does it mean if exile is death? I think you see where I'm going with this. The restoration from exile is the resurrection from the dead. So Jesus is raised from the dead, and according to Paul, it says he is declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness in his resurrection from the dead. Which means in his resurrection he is constituted as the enthroned Son of God, who according to Psalm 2, the Son of David inherits not only the land but also all nations. He's constituted as the one who rules over the nations, and thus gathers all things into his kingdom, and this is the means by which the regathering from exile occurs. Now, if you look at Isaiah 40 to 55, it's very interesting because what you see is not so much a story of a movement from the wilderness to the promised land. There is that language, but there's also language of coming into the land of inheritance by transforming the wilderness into a promised land. There is language in Isaiah 60 of the gathering of all nations to Jerusalem, as there is in Isaiah 2 and elsewhere. But the literary match for Isaiah 2 is Isaiah 66, where it's not the nations coming to Zion, it's the remnant of Israel, who are called survivors there, Isaiah and in Isaiah 10 and in elsewhere, who are being sent to declare God's glory to the nations. So we can see there's this twofold movement going on, hinting at, and in fact more than hinting, but I don't have time to prove that all right now, there's a conceptual flexibility which is going on here in the prophets. And we have to understand the way in which these concepts are flexible, because if we don't get the conceptual flexibility, then we're not going to be able to understand exactly what Moses and the prophets have to say to us. And understanding the conceptual flexibility, that takes a long time to demonstrate. There's lots of stuff to go through, and this is why I have no planned end for this series. It's just going to be doing a lot of, ground building, and then we're going to build stuff on top of that. And, as it just develops and grows, I hope to kind of get more and more of my thoughts out on audio or video or some way or another. So that is kind of the theme of the gathering of Israel. Now, if the resurrection is what constitutes the restoration of Israel from exile, because Jesus is the one man Israel. Now, what this suggests, and actually what it means in the New Testament, is baptism corresponds to the Red Sea, because baptism is that by which we participate in Jesus' resurrection. Jesus' resurrection is the return from exile. The return from exile is the new Exodus. Therefore, baptism is the new Exodus. What this suggests is that we're incorporated into him somehow, incorporated into Israel's Messiah. Again, lots of stuff we can go over here. I just want to make a point here that in Isaiah 55, lots of people say, it's very strange to me that people say there's nothing in Isaiah 40 to 55 which hints at the servant is Messiah. Well, if the Messiah is fundamentally the son of David, if that's the thing that we can all agree that Messiah is all about. He's the son of David. If he's nothing else, he's the son of David. He's the one who inherits David's throne. Well, what does Isaiah 55 tell us? Isaiah 55, verse 3 says, Incline your ear, he's speaking to the whole nation, by the way. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear that your soul may live, and I will make with you an everlasting covenant, my steadfast sure love for David. Behold, I made him a witness to the peoples, a leader, a commander for the peoples. Behold, you shall call a nation that you do not know. A nation that you did not know shall run to you, because the Lord, the God of your God, and the Holy One of Israel has glorified you. Well, here we can see that the whole nation is being addressed as some kind of corporate David, which is very interesting. If you follow what I would argue, which is that the servant is the one man Israel, and then the servant incorporates all these others into him. And that's why in Isaiah 54, what do we see in the last verse of Isaiah 54? See, this is the heritage, or the inheritance of the servants of the Lord. It's used in the plural. The plural servants of the Lord is not something which is used in Isaiah 53 or preceding. It's interesting the way that the kind of the literary strategy unfolds. We see in Isaiah 54 also, we hear things like this. Isaiah 54:2, enlarge the place of your tent, and let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords. Strengthen your stakes. You will spread abroad to the right and to the left. Your seed will possess the nations, will people the desolate cities. Fear not, you will not be ashamed. Be not confounded, you will not be disgraced. You will forget the shame of your youth. Speaking to daughter Zion here. Keep that in mind. And the reproach of your widowhood you will remember no more. For your Maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. The God of the whole earth he is called. The God of the whole earth he is called. So we have the servant. He does what he does. We hear that he's put in the grave. Then we hear he prolongs his days. He sees his seed. Why does it say he sees his seed? Because who's the woman here? The woman is Zion. This is not literal language. The seed is the seed which is born by the union of the servant and Zion. And that produces seed. And the seed are those who are united to the servant. That's why there are a bunch of little servants in 54:17. And that's why there's this corporate nation which is identified somehow collectively with the Davidic covenant in Isaiah 55. It all rolls together very, very nicely. This is why in Isaiah 50 we hear the servant, people are spitting in his face. Well, that's what you do to the kinsman redeemer who does not fulfill his duty, according to Deuteronomy 25. And what is the kinsman redeemer supposed to do? Well, you have a wife who doesn't have any children. Her husband has died before producing any seed. So you have a brother who comes and he goes into the wife and he produces viable seed for his husband. There's a broader typology to go on here, but this symbol was very important in Isaiah. And this is what makes the servant language so intelligible, that the servant is the kinsman redeemer. The servant is the one who marries Zion, who was barren before, but now has more children she knows what to do with. Zion now has so many children that they need more land, so they expand to the left and to the right. Does this mean that everyone in the Messianic age, or the eschatological age, or whatever you want to call it, is going to be a blood descendant of Abraham? Of course not. What this indicates is that there's adoption going on. There's something different going on. We hear about the seed of Zion, the seed of Abraham and Sarah, as who are named in Isaiah 40:55. We hear about them spreading abroad to the left and to the right. They're moving outwards, whereas the gathering is something which moves inwards. Again, there's a double movement here, and we're really supposed to interpret these images in light of each other. You go to Isaiah 66, which I think I meant to quote at the beginning. I don't know why I'm just returning to it now, but as always, it turns into a bit of a stream of consciousness thing. Isaiah 66, we see that there is, let me just note this, Isaiah 6, okay, it says, the seraphim say, the whole earth is full of his glory, speaking of God's. Glory is not something which is just a way of saying God is awesome. Right? The glory of God is something very specific. It's this cloud phenomenon which goes with Israel in the wilderness, which fills the Holy of Holies. To speak of the whole earth being full of the glory of the Lord is to say something about the entire earth being filled with his presence, being a temple of sorts. The creation is this cosmic temple. The language used, the whole earth is full of his glory, is taken straight from Numbers 14. And Numbers 14 speaks of nations who have not heard my fame or seen my glory. And this is the language that's used in Isaiah 66. Isaiah 66 and Isaiah 65, very important because we hear things like this. Behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth. And just a few sentences later, for behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy and her people to be a gladness. So I create a new heavens and new earth. I create Jerusalem to be a joy. Ezekiel 40, we see that the temple is actually the city of God. There's a city temple, the city filled with the glory of God. And we see the same language being used here to describe the whole renewal of creation as the New Jerusalem. We should be open to understanding that the prophets were giving us language which is not allegorizing away the promises, but showing that the promises were greater than ever could have been imagined before. This is not something which excludes Israel according to the flesh, or those who we call the Jewish people, which I'll deal with in another discussion. We see, so the temple is, in a sense, the whole creation. That's why God says, Isaiah 66:1, thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. It's the Ark of the Covenant, which is supposed to be his footstool. What is the house he would build for me? What is the place of my rest? All things my hand has made. All of these things came to be, declares the Lord. That should remind you, by the way, of Daniel 2. We see that there is a stone not cut by human hands, which will break down all the kingdoms of the earth and fill the whole world as a great mountain. Of course, this is something we can't deal with in depth here, but I just want you to notice that the temple language here is not necessarily referring to a stone temple that's limited to one place with veils sealing off the presence of God. Now, you can disagree with me here, and I would grant you that I haven't given you enough to prove that if you're not already convinced, but there's stuff to at least maybe open all of our horizons to meanings and directions that the prophets are going, which we didn't expect at first. Something very important. They shall bring, this is talking about the survivors or the remnant of Israel. Those two concepts are used in parallel in Isaiah and other prophets. They, the remnant of Israel, who have just gone and they've declared God's glory to the nations, they shall bring all your brothers from all the nations as an offering to the Lord, on horses and chariots and litters and mules and dromedaries, to my holy mountain Jerusalem, says the Lord, just as the Israelites bring their tribute offering in a clean vessel to the house of the Lord. The tribute offering is the bread and wine offering. Leviticus 2, we hear about bread, Leviticus 2. Wine is added when they come into the land of their inheritance because it has these big grapevines, according to the book of Numbers. And here's something that's very important. Some of them, speaking of the Gentile brothers who are brought as a tribute, some of them also I will take for priests and for Levites, says the Lord. For as the new heavens and the new earth that I make shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. Now here's the thing. Priests and Levites, this is not, in ancient Israel, we're not talking about the Catholic Church. You're not ordained by going to seminary and getting someone to lay your hands upon you. I'm not making fun of that at all. I believe that's a real thing. But that's not the way that is done. How do you become a Cohen in ancient Israel? You don't become a Cohen. You're born one or you're not. So when we hear this about becoming Gentiles, by the way, Gentiles, becoming priests and Levites, we should understand that something is going on here that cannot be fully made intelligible in light of the regulations, and I don't use regulation as a pejorative, that is given in the 5-book Torah. There's something bigger going on here. And so when we hear about the renewal of the Levitical priesthood in Malachi and other prophets, we should not say, well, the Levitical priesthood is renewed. Jesus didn't do that, so how is Jesus the Messiah? Already in Isaiah 66, we're being given signs that the Levitical priesthood, when we hear about it spoken of prophetically, we cannot just limit it to exactly what the Levitical priesthood means in the 5-book Torah, or what we would call as Christians the Old Covenant. More to say about that as always. So I've spent a lot of time on the gathering of Israel, language, or the return from exile, the new Exodus. One more thing I want to go to kind of get back to the basics here on the question of the gathering of Israel, the return from exile. We say the new Exodus occurs personally in the resurrection of Jesus as Israel's Messiah and as the one-man Israel, because exile is death, and thus return from exile is resurrection, glorification, as Ezekiel himself describes it in a vision in Ezekiel chapter 37. Well, Numbers 23 to 24. gives us this kind of idea that there is an Exodus, and then the Messiah personally embodies that Exodus. We see in Numbers 23 to 24. It's one of 4 major poems in the Torah. So this is one of the ways that Moses is going to structure the Torah. It has a definite literary structure, and he's trying to point us to something by it. Now we have Balak and Balaam. Remember, Balak is the king. He wants Balaam, who's a prophet, to curse Israel. So he hires Balaam to do it. Balaam says, I can't do it because the God of Israel has put in my mouth only blessing, not curse. And he prophesies in Numbers 23, speaking about the Exodus which has already occurred. It says, Numbers 23, verse 21, he has not beheld misfortune in Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel. The Lord their God is with them. The shout of a king is among them. God brings them out of Egypt, and is for them like the horns of a wild ox. Then verse 24, skipping a couple lines. Behold, a people, as a lioness it rises up, as a lion it lifts itself, it does not lie down until it's devoured the prey, and drunk the blood of the slain. So that's talking about Israel corporately. That's talking about the Exodus that we've already read about in the book of Exodus. Then Numbers 24. Numbers 24 speaks of something different. Now in Numbers 24, we read this. When Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go at other times to look for omens, but set his face toward the wilderness. Balaam lifted up his eyes and saw Israel camping tribe by tribe. And the Spirit of God came upon him, and he took up his discourse and said, The oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty, Shaddai, falling down with his eyes uncovered. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, and your encampments, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch afar, like gardens beside a river, like aloes the Lord has planted, like cedar trees beside the waters. Water shall flow from his buckets. His seed shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than... Now here's a textual variant between the LXX and the Hebrew text. The LXX and other texts attest to Gog. It says, king shall be higher than Gog, as in Gog and Magog. Gog is the king of Magog. And the Masoretic says Agag, who's the king of the Amalekites. I'll just say a couple words about that in a couple moments. And his kingdom, that is speaking of the king, shall be exalted. God brings him out of Egypt, and is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He shall eat up the nations, his adversaries. He shall break their bones in pieces, and pierce them through with his arrows. He crouched, he lay down like a lion, and like a lioness, who will rouse him up? Blessed are those who bless you, cursed are those who curse you. So here we see that there has been a prophetic description of what has already happened to Israel, corporately, and then the very same language is taken up and applied to this Messianic king, and I'm going to call him the Messianic king for specific reasons that can be detailed at great length at another time, but I don't think that this is widely disputed. This is speaking of the Messianic king. And so the Messianic king embodies and recapitulates kind of the whole story of corporate Israel. Why? Well, because already in the Torah, there's the central focus is on the new Exodus, right? So Deuteronomy 30, talking about the regathering of Israel, is given before the first gathering of Israel. The return from exile, the return to their inheritance, is promised before they come into their inheritance for the first time. So we already see that the literary structure of the Torah is focused upon the prophetic hope of a new covenant. This is one of the ways that I think Christians and Jews read this same scriptures very differently. That this probably generalizes a bit too much, but I think it captures something. Christians read the Hebrew Bible with a prophetic accent, whereas I think Jewish readers or Jewish friends read it with much more of a quote-unquote legal accent, and that's not pejorative at all. I mean, God's law is holy and righteous and good, but the Pentateuch, the Torah, is also prophecy. It's meant to point towards something, and that's something that we Christians have emphasized a lot more. And I think, obviously, as a Christian, I think we're right to do that. I think that's there in the Torah itself, that the Messiah embodies corporate Israel. Okay, so that's that. So there's this new Exodus, corporately embodied, or personally enacted by Israel's Messiah as the corporate embodiment of Israel, already taught in the Torah itself. We don't even need to go to the prophets. Another thing that's interesting here. Third way that the Messiah is anointed, prophets are anointed. We say as Christians, we think Jesus is the prophet like Moses. So the question is, according to Deuteronomy 18, are we hearing about one specific prophet, or is this about a prophetic office? Well, I think when you read the end of Deuteronomy, tradition says that Ezra kind of completed the Tanakh, gave it its final compositional shape, and I think that's correct. Don't have time to talk about that now, but I think this is clearly written after the time of the writing prophets. This is written kind of as a seal and completion of the Torah in its canonical context. It says at the very end of Deuteronomy, "There has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him, for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in all the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and to all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel." So this is referring to the prophet like Moses, Deuteronomy 18. And what we hear here is, which makes no sense if it's written early in Israel's history. I mean, this is written after a whole line of prophets has come and gone. We see that the prophet like Moses has not come. And moreover, what is it that makes him like Moses? Well, what makes him like Moses is that he does the kinds of things that Moses did in the land of Egypt. This is about a new Exodus. And that makes perfect sense within the canonical context of the Torah, and in fact the rest of the Tanakh as a whole, which is about enacting this new Exodus, which is about bringing the circumcision of the heart that comes with the new Exodus, that finally cleanses the leprosy from the hearts of the people that was signified in Exodus 4. I think I talked about this in the other video. The prophet like Moses, and we identify him with the Messiah. Why do we identify him with the Messiah? Well, a few reasons. First of all, Moses is a royal figure in the Pentateuch. Moses is described using royal terminology. The most straightforward example, there are plenty of others, but I'm just going to rely on this straightforward example. Deuteronomy 33 says that Moses became king in Jeshurun when he gave the Torah. This anticipates, I think, what you see in Isaiah 40 to 55, where the servant is also a giver of the Torah. And it anticipates ideas about the Torah of the Messiah, which is spoken about in the New Testament, and indeed, as I understand it, in Jewish tradition, but I'm not going to make any definite claims about that. And also, so Moses is a royal figure. The Messiah, according to Numbers 24, he plays this leading role in enacting the Exodus. We see at the beginning of the book of Exodus, the whole story of Moses going into Midian, having to flee Pharaoh, being chased by Pharaoh. This is an anticipation of the Exodus. So this conceptual link between Moses, the head of the people, and kind of the people as a whole and the king, this is already made in the story itself. And also in Numbers 22 to 24, there is a triple attempt to curse Israel. What happens on the third time? The third time you get the promise of this king who is from the line of Judah. We know that because the very language used is taken straight from Genesis 49, which is explicitly about the king from the line of Judah. This is the Messianic king. And so it's a triple attempt to curse. Then you get the one who will ultimately crush the head of Israel's enemies. What that means we'll talk about in future videos, as always. Just like in the original Exodus story, okay, there was a triple attempt to destroy Israel. Third attempt ultimately brings forth Moses, who redeems, blesses Israel, gives Israel the covenant, becomes king in Jeshurun. Okay, so that's the overall structure. So Messiah in Christianity, and I think it's well rooted in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, is priest, king, prophet. He is Mashiach in all three of these senses. But the concept of the Messiah is kind of a shorthand that is in use by the time of the New Testament, by the apostolic period. And it continues to be in use in later Judaism. The Messiah is a shorthand for referring to this specific figure that unfolds and develops, and we see him kind of accumulate characteristics as we go through the Hebrew Bible. And so that's the deal. As always, it ends up being more than an introduction, but there's another video, part two. There is some overlap, but there's really not that much overlap between the two. I hope that you have learned something, and I imagine, even though I've talked as if I'm talking to those who don't believe, I'm sure most of those who are listening to me are believers. So I hope this has edified you in some way, and I do ask for your continuing prayers, because they are very much appreciated and they absolutely work. So please remember, your prayers work. Pray for me. Also pray for yourself. They really work. Trust me on this one. Okay. Bye-bye.